You verbally tell me, Cheryl, because I can't see anybody when I share it.
We can.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, okay, hello. Nice to see you again. If I've seen you before, I'm aware that there's quite a few more people in the space than when I was last here, kind of doing a generic overview of CBT. So for context and some background, I did work in a talking therapist, so an IAP service, and I was a PWP within that service. So this will be an overview of essentially what CEDA and Exeter University would have taught us, but in a very brief way because it's psychoeducational format within the constructs of a conversation rather than an intervention and a therapeutic intervention. So that's something to hold in mind when we go through it. So in terms of today, just a very brief outline, look at kind of some causes of low mood, symptoms of low mood. Then we're going to look at very specific interventions. So they can be categorized into what we know as behavioral activation. Then there's a cognitive restructuring. And then sometimes after cognitive restructuring, people might need a little bit more of a nudge to help them overcome some difficult thinking patterns. And that's where you might see some behavioral experiments come in. And then at the very end, we've got some, as I did last time, for those of you that are aware, some self-practice, self-reflection skills, which I'm a massive fan of. If you're using any kind of therapeutic intervention, always learn to use it for yourself as well. So as we go through, please feel free to, I don't know what the regular structure is, Cheryl, if you're happy for people to ask questions throughout, or if you want to hold questions until the end like we did last time.
It's what's works better for you. I mean,
Okay.
it might be hard to see hands
That's
sort
true.
of up, so maybe at the end.
Yeah, if that's okay, everybody, if you please write down your questions and hold on to them, but I will try and answer them. We've got slightly longer today, so I feel like I can take a little bit of a breath between what I'm saying, but absolutely bring your questions and I'll happily try and do my best to answer them. So in terms of, to begin with then, simple causes of low mood and that can escalate into depression, I'm sure you're all aware of a lot of these. So feeling cut off from others, some childhood experiences, life events. So sometimes, you know, we may experience low mood after going through some unwelcome, stressful, or even traumatic events. But there may be a lot of different events that might trigger low mood. So that could be things like losing your job, experiencing financial hardship. We know there's a massive overlap with social and health inequalities with things like low mood and depression and anxiety. Maybe you're having some relational difficulties or ends of relationships. Maybe there's a bereavement, even changing jobs, moving house, getting married can all lead to symptoms of low mood and then escalate into depression. There's obviously some things around the childhood experiences, but even adult experiences around physical, sexual, financial, emotional, etc. abuse and assault. And also being bullied. And I think there's something around that we need to be all collectively aware of, that weathering hypothesis of being continuously exposed to institutionalized racism. And that can really have quite a profound impact on things like mood and anxiety. Things like thinking styles, which I briefly mentioned in my last kind of CBT overview, but we will be looking at again today in more detail. Other mental, but also physical health problems. So again, we know that poor physical health has a massive correlation with things like low mood and anxiety. Many health problems can be really difficult to manage as well, and that can also affect your mood. It's not necessarily the physical health problem itself, but the management of that. So things like chronic or long-term health conditions, things that cause like chronic pain, ongoing pain and discomfort, also life-threatening illnesses, so people that might have a terminal illness or people that are coming out of intensive care or hospital wards can ultimately be impacted by things like a lack of mobility, a very different lifestyle or way of living that wasn't impacting them before the illness, because it can significantly change your lifestyle. So there are also some very specific difficulties that we might need to be aware of with physical health. So things like hormonal difficulties. So perimenopause is really common for people to develop kind of symptoms of low mood and anxiety. Is that low mood and anxiety, or is that perimenopause? And I think that's always a question that we need to be looking at. And that's the same with things like the menopause as well. There's also thyroid and parathyroid problems that can also lead into symptoms of low mood. conditions that affect the brain and the nervous system. So a lot of the clients that we might see with complex needs might have had some sort of chronic condition where overuse of alcohol actually impacts the structure of the brain, which can therefore cause symptoms of low mood. Then there are also things like sleep problems, nightmares, flashbacks through that as well. In terms of mental health difficulties as well, I will say that if you've got, I forgot to say this, but if there's certain difficulties like psychosis, for example, so I just spent the last year in early intervention teams, if you've had a past history of certain difficulties, there's actually a 50% likelihood of developing anxiety or depression within 12 months of having a first episode psychosis. So that's why when we have early intervention psychosis teams, they typically support the person for 3 years, because there's a likelihood of those symptoms kind of moving into depression and obviously other mental health difficulties. Things like medications can have quite a significant impact on mood. And again, sleep, diet, and exercise also have massive impacts on mood. And as I've mentioned, recreational substance use. So with substance users, you might see someone feeling really, really terrible about what's happening for them, whether that's mood, whether that's anxiety, whether that's experiences that we don't share in our kind of consensus reality. They will then use substances, and then on that down regulation actually generally feel a lot worse. And those moods that they were experiencing pre-substance use actually escalate post-substance use. So in terms of basic symptoms of depression, I'm sure we're all aware of those. But what you might feel is down, upset, tearful. You might feel restless, agitated, guilty, empty, isolated. So really thinking about social activation and isolation is a really big thing. And that's what you might see when I worked as a PWP. We saw a lot of older adults coming into the service because of that simple fact of isolation. A lot of their friends are going through stages where they are passing away. You will see usually a lack of pleasure or very little pleasure in things that you used to enjoy. You might see irritability, a sense of unreality, a lack of confidence or self-esteem. That hopelessness and feeling really tired and lethargic all of the time is also really, really common. So that's what you might feel, but how might you act? Well, you might start to avoid social events or activities. You might self-harm or have suicidal ideation or behavior. You might have really difficulties with your brain because of the brain fog that you're experiencing. So it might make making decisions really difficult. You'll have a lower libido quite often, having difficulty in terms of remembering, concentrating. So that comes back to that brain fog effect. And if you're already using substances like alcohol, smoking, vaping, that might just increase as a way of trying to manage. Sleeping might change, so that can either be too much or too little, depending on the person, depending on the time. And again, that also fluctuates with food and eating. You might also get a manifestation of mental health difficulties through physical pains, but also alongside having chronic pain or chronic fatigue symptoms, they might then escalate as well as a result of having low mood. Your movement might be noticeably different. So for some people, that means that they're more restless. They might get a restless leg, or they might just move more slowly around the space. So that's generally things that you might feel, but also things that you might see. So for those of you that were here last time, you'll probably remember this CBT cycle for depression. So CBT as an overview is going through the physical feelings, emotions, behaviors, and thoughts. In this example, you can see that the thoughts might be, what's the point? I'm a failure. You then might feel physically exhausted. Your emotion is that you might feel shamed or embarrassed. And then the behavior is that you don't speak to anybody or see people. And if you do, you snap at them more often. So in this, there are generally two approaches as to how you can work with low mood. There's a behavioral approach and there's a cognitive approach, hence the fact that it's cognitive behavioral therapy. And the first one we're going to look at is the behavioral approach. So on this cycle, this is essentially demonstrating a cycle of depression with reduced activity. So the whole idea with behavioral activation is to, before we can think our way out of depression, we need to try and act our way out of it first. Because we're so mentally and physically exhausted, having those battles and fights are easier to do. It sounds paradoxical and a juxtaposition to say, well, actually, you're so knackered that you need to act your way out of it first, but actually it does really, really help. So what we might see in that reduced cycle is that you're emotionally feeling down, so therefore you feel more tired, you have less motivation, and that's when those negative thoughts start to spiral for you. And as a result, you avoid kind of doing things that you used to enjoy or even value. And then initially, because you're not doing those things, you might feel a sense of relief. Because actually, oh, I don't have to put myself through that. Oh, I didn't have to get ready and get dressed and I didn't have to do that thing. Great, I can sit down and just numb myself to the world. But then as a result, you start to do less and less and then miss more and more of the things that you used to value and enjoy. And those things that you maybe needed to do in the house, at home for yourself, begin to stack up. And actually, that's when you start to really struggle with those day-to-day tasks. And then as a result, your mood will drop even more and mean that you experience even greater relief from doing less and less, but actually that will increase the low mood in the long run. So essentially, it's a way of acting our way out of depression before we can think our way out. So whilst it's understandable to avoid doing things, the sense of relief is generally unhelpful in the long term. So behavioral activation works by doing the opposite of the cycle. So as your mood kind of is at the base of being really, really low and you've reduced everything that you're doing, what we might do in conversation using CBT is we might help someone to engage in an activity that feels manageable at the time of where they're at and what feels doable for them. And then as a result of doing that, there might be a sense of enjoyment or achievement. Sometimes it's very minimal, but actually very baby steps with behavioral activation. So you might start to get that sense of enjoyment or at least sense of achievement, which can then start to lift your mood. Even if only minimally, it can start to lift your mood. And what we all notice is when we're feeling happier, generally we feel less tired, we're more motivated, we're less irritable, and generally we have better concentration skills. So as our mood begins to lift, we can already start to engage in activities that, coming back, give us more sense of achievement and enjoyment. And that's when we've started to got a bit more energy, a bit more motivation. We're doing the things that we need to do to keep ourselves kind of going in the day-to-day life. That's when we can start to think about challenging those unhelpful thinking habits that can kind of be present during low mood. Sometimes behavioral activation is enough and we don't need to go into cognitive restructuring. So I know for a lot of the people that I worked with as a PWP, if we started with behavioral activation, 9 times out of 10, we wouldn't need to do any more. So how do we do it? The really important thing with anything CBT is do not miss a step and go at the pace that you're both really comfortable with. Yes, there's a point of kind of pushing a little bit, and that's our role to kind of just help support someone, give them some empowerment to believe that they can, but we need to go at the pace of the person we're working with. So step 1 is always to understand what you're currently doing. So taking a map, let's identify what we're doing. Step 2 is then to think about activities that we've stopped doing, reduced, or things that we would like to do. Then we'd like to organise them by how difficult they are to do now. So I know when I've experienced low mood, showering is an incredibly difficult task to do when I'm feeling really, really low. So actually for me, maybe showering isn't appropriate right now, but maybe like a little wash in the sink might be enough to help me feel like I've achieved something. And then over the course of a week, I might then escalate into a shower. Then what we might do is plan activities back into the week, give it a go. And then finally, what we land on is how did we get on? How was it this week? When we planned in these activities, what came up for you? How do you feel? Better, worse? And we'll troubleshoot as we go on. So all of these kind of images that I've got coming up here are freely available. So they are freely available on the Exeter University CEDAR, so that's CEDAR website. And they are all PWP kind of manuals, I guess, for working through things like low mood with behavioural activation, cognitive restructuring, panic, exposure, etc. So they're all freely available and I'll happily share the link. So in terms of the baseline diary, the point is we identify what we're doing and what we're not doing and how that impacts your mood. So I've once worked with someone who said, well, I do all of the things that are necessary for me to do. So things like laundry, showering, cooking. Okay, great. What about it is causing you the lower mood? Well, actually, it's where I am. I'm living at home with my dad, and he's around me all the time and he's badgering me about doing that stuff. Okay, well, is that behavioral activation we need to work on then, or is that something else? So all of these are keys around the what, the where, the who, and the when around the activity that might give us some insights as to what we can use in conversation. It also helps us identify things that you've reduced or stopped doing. So I know when I get more and more stressed, I am less and less likely to go to the gym, but I know I enjoy the gym. So it's thinking about where would I have gone in that week and how is that affecting me by not going? Again, maybe you notice certain places, activities, or people that might influence mood. Or you may notice that the week completely does not have any activities or people any day of the week. And that's really, really common with low mood. So it's just the starting point. What's really important is when I've worked with people that have kind of brought the diary and gone, well, I've done nothing with my week, they feel really low and dejected because I've made them highlight that they've done nothing with their week. But essentially, what we're trying to do by that is to get them to recognize what's happening for them at the moment and really bring some attention and focus into that so that we can start to think about changes that we can use to improve mood. What we do from there is we start to identify activities. So as you can see on this sheet, we've got it split between routine, necessary, and pleasurable. So routine is essentially things that you do regularly, and that's often everyday things like showering, hair washing, cleaning, shopping, cooking, etc. These routine activities provide structure to the day. The necessary activities are activities that, if they are left undone, have a consequence. So they often lead to negative consequences. So I know right now that I have until the 5th of June that I need to MOT my car. Can I be asked to do that? No, but if I had low mood, that might be a real pressing thing where I'm going, oh my goodness, why can't I just book my car in? What is so wrong with me that I can't book my car in to get an MOT done? And it's this kind of self-perpetuation cycle. Pleasurable activities are activities that typically bring pleasure and are really valued to you. So these could be things that you've never done before. So I know on my bucket list, I'd love to go and see Pennywell Farm. For those of you that are local or know Pennywell, I really want to go. Or it could be things that you have done before and you have stopped doing. It can include things like socializing and hobbies. So what we would do is go, okay, what's your baseline diary? What would you like to have in there? What's the ideal structure? What's the ideal routine stuff that you do most days? What's the ideal stuff that's pleasurable that you get a sense of enjoyment from? And what things right now are really weighing heavy on your mind because they need to be dealt with and they need to be sorted out? They're the kinds of conversations that I would have, and I would get them to write it as a form of a list. Common potential block is, but I don't enjoy anything anymore, which is something that I've heard a lot as a PWP when trying to get the lists around pleasurable activities, excuse me, is that they will frequently say, but I don't enjoy things anymore. There's nothing for me that's pleasurable. And I guess the role of it for us is to just normalize that. You know, when we're experiencing low mood, it's really common to lose a sense of enjoyment, really common to lose the love for doing things that we did before. And activities that were once pleasurable just don't feel the same. So I guess it's a case of, if you're not currently enjoying the activity, but you did used to, it's still helpful to write that down. And maybe as your mood improves over time and we start to build up that sense of motivation and a sense of achievement, we might start to notice that things that gave us enjoyment before start to give us enjoyment again. Then what we would do, step 3, is look at that entire list of routine, necessary, pleasurable, and we would split it into how hard it is. Because as I said to you before, sometimes when I've been in really states of low mood where I've been really quite poorly, actually the idea of a shower itself is just, it's impossible. It feels like dragging myself up a mountain. So actually, by splitting it into the least, medium, and most, what we can do over time is, even just if we build a sense of mastery and achievement just by focusing on the least difficult things, that's sometimes enough to start building the momentum for someone to think, okay, I can do this. This is something that's okay for me. So least difficult things might be activities that you can manage this week or even the next couple of weeks. I've worked with someone where the least difficult has stayed there for a period of 5 weeks. And actually, at that 5 week stage, we were kind of going, okay, I'm going to add one thing that's medium difficulty. Okay, great. We're going to go at your pace for this. The medium difficulty is things that you may struggle to do in the next few weeks, but if it's necessary, so this is where you think about whether it's routine, necessary, or pleasurable, but if it's needed, you could manage to do it. And there's a way that we can think about how to break that down and make it easier as well. And then we've got most difficult. So activities that are far too difficult to complete currently, but there are things that we can do to work towards achieving them. And ultimately, we want a mix. So if you notice that all of the least difficult things are the routine things or the pleasurable things in that list, that's not going to work because we want our week to be across routine, necessary, and pleasurable. We don't just want routine throughout the whole week because where's the sense of enjoyment? We don't want the sense of pleasure across the whole week because we're obligated to do things to be adults. We need to run our lives. So we need to have a nice mixture across that. So this is where that level of difficulty really comes in of mixing the routine, necessary, and pleasurable across all 3 domains of difficulty. Then what we do is we plan it. Simple as that. So what's really important with behavioral activation is, and something that comes back a lot when I'm working with people is, but it was in my diary, but I just didn't feel like it. So what's really important to remember is pre-planning and doing that with ourselves in conversation is really important because it will help someone really stick to what's in their diary versus your mood. And that then prevents that low mood cycle coming back. Because if it's programmed in and they go, oh, I should have done this thing. Oh my gosh, why did I miss that? It's in my diary. I should have done this thing, but I didn't. And it becomes again a self-punishing kind of cycle for low mood. So it's really important to remember, I suppose, planning and sticking to what's in there. Ideally, we would always begin with starting with activities identified as least difficult or something that has an urgent necessity. So for some people, that might be paying a certain bill, it might be seeking a certain support or seeking some help from someone. We really want to be adding that in to be dealt with quite quickly, simply because the idea of necessary is that if we don't do it, there are negative consequences if we don't. So we want to minimize those negative consequences. I will come to how we might do that more constructively in a minute, so hold that. Then we're going to think about what's the best day, what's the best time to engage in each activity. So when I've worked with people who might have, let's say they have therapy with me on a Tuesday, they might then say, do you know what? I'm so battered after our hour together that I just need a day of chilling out. Okay, have a day. What are the things that are essential within that day? What's one thing that you could add in? And then the rest of the day is yours to use as you see fit. We're not looking to ram this diary full. We're looking to put things in that feel okay, feel manageable, and build up gradually a sense of mastery and achievement. Then we're going to be really specific. So as I mentioned before about looking at the diary of what you're doing at the moment, we're going to be using the 4 W's, which is the what, where, when, and who. So I haven't got when on there because it's already on the sheet on the side, because you can see it's morning, afternoon, or evening. And we then need to spread the activities out across the week. So something that's quite common in behavioral activation is something called boom and bust. I don't know if anybody's come across that term before, but essentially boom and bust means that you're overloading yourself on a few specific days and then leaving other activities or other days with 0 activities. And I don't know if anybody's ever done this where I'm really guilty of it, is where I've got a list of things to do on a weekend and I'm like, right, I'm going to get everything done on this list. How bloody knackered do you feel at the end of the weekend when you've tried to fit everything that you need to do in? It's exhausting, and that has the opposite effect. What we want to do is gradually, slowly build up that sense of achievement and motivation, not pull out of a gate, let's go, all of the motivation, I'm going to get everything done, and then you just crash from sheer levels of exhaustion. So it's really helpful when we're planning this out. That's why we need the mix of the routine, necessary, pleasurable. It's why we need the easiest or the least difficult activities first. And it's really important that we spread those activities out. I've had clients that I've worked with that have only added 2 least difficulty activities in for their week, the first week. And even over time, for the 5 weeks person that I'm thinking of, well, there's been a few, but the 5 weeks person in particular, we've probably managed up to maybe 4 or 5 activities across the 7-day week. So we've tried to keep it really minimal and just building up. But again, it's at the pace of the person that they want to work with, but just holding in mind that people are so keen to not feel so rubbish that they want to go for it and get everything done. And that can lead to boom and bust. Sometimes, again, I want to normalize that it's okay not to have any activities in. It's absolutely okay to not plan anything and avoid boom and bust. I've spoken too soon for my PowerPoint. Okay, so step 5 would be to give it a go. So at this point, I've often found some, I guess people have vocalized some fears around it. So a really common one might be, I can't even get started. So it might be that you're thinking you don't have the motivation to start. Maybe even the least difficult activities when your mood is so low and the motivation drops as well. And then we're not doing those least difficult activities, then that vicious cycle of depression starts. So it's really, really hard for people to get started. I don't feel like doing the activities that I've planned in. Okay, that's also fine. And mood does dictate what we do and don't want to do, but sometimes there are things that are necessary. So sometimes what's helpful for individuals that don't feel like it is just trying something like a 5-minute rule. So say I really don't fancy hoovering the living room, I'll go, right, I'm just going to see what I can whip round in 5 minutes. Something that I do for myself, which is not depression, but it is a 5-minute, essentially similar rule, is if I'm boiling the kettle for a cup of tea and I'm stood there waiting for the kettle to boil, I'll see if I can unload the dishwasher in that time. And however long it takes for the kettle to boil, as soon as it's boiled, I'll stop unloading the dishwasher and I'll leave the rest. And then when I make another kettle or another cup of tea and boil the kettle again, I'll go back and finish what I started. So there's ways of kind of chunking activities. There's also ways of kind of doing the activity in a very different way. So it might mean being a little bit more creative. So I've just remembered thinking about working with a lady who had cognitive difficulties surrounding memory. So different ways of doing the activity for her. A lot of the behavioral activation was because her memory was also so poor. It was really helpful to have it written and on a schedule. So the way that she did the activity was she created a whole family behavioral activation board, and everyone had their own kind of like pictures that were chosen by them. So it could be, I think they were all kind of emojis. So do you know the heart eye emojis or the crying, laughing emojis? Everyone got to pick their own. She printed them out and she was like, right, this is what this person is doing today. And they would draw fun faces, or they'd put their emoji face on a temperature gauge of where their mood was for that day as well. So it's just thinking about ways that you can do the activity that might engage family or friends around you, but also ways that are tolerable and adapted to the person. Then you've got things like, I don't have the motivational energy. And I guess this is where sometimes we might hold a bit of tough love, in the sense of, if we always wait to feel motivated to do something, we can all be waiting a very long time. So you may find that your motivation will slowly improve once you manage to overcome that initial motivation hurdle. and this will drive you on to carry on and complete the activity. So I guess for us, it's really important that if we do plan that in and we go at their pace and we say, what do you feel comfortable planning? Our role then is to go, okay, so how have you done it? It's really important to follow the plan as much as we can and as much as possible. Obviously, things will come up in life, like you might fall it. I'm noticing that I'm bringing in a memory. You might fall over and then hurt yourself, and therefore you can't go in to work in the morning because you've got to go to minor injuries unit, for example. So there are things that come up, and that's okay, but it's working around that in as much as we can. So I guess the point is just making a start on the activity and overcoming that initial hurdle can help build up that momentum and finding a way that works for that person to be able to do that. Then the next thing is the final stage, I guess, which is the review and maintenance. So once you've started to get into a routine around behavioral activation and you've come back and you review, how was your week? How did it go? What did you notice? We can start to hold in mind what might be our early warning signs for things like low mood. So when I say early warning signs, it could be behaviors that you notice, emotions, physical symptoms, and some unhelpful thinking styles. So for me, behaviors when I start to kind of get lower in mood might be I really don't want to go to the gym, I don't want to socialize, I don't want to see people. Emotions, I might just be feeling like just a little bit down, just not feeling myself, I guess is kind of a really weird way of saying it, but sad, down. The physical symptoms I'm probably more in tune with, so feeling a bit more heavy, feeling a bit more lethargic, a bit more tired. And my unhelpful thoughts are, well, why would you go out and socialize anyway? You're going to be no fun because you're just moody at the moment. So really kind of checking in with those early warning signs as well. When I say review and maintenance, these are things that you can review weekly when you're doing that behavioral activation. But I would also say that this early warning signs and staying well are generally after you've done maybe 6-7 weeks of behavioral activation. And over those 6 or 7 weeks, you'd be gradually increasing in terms of difficulty, or even just staying in least difficult, but actually expanding over the course of how many activities you do in the week. So thinking of things like chunking can be really helpful. Thinking of things like time limitations can be really helpful. Thinking about how you might make necessary activities, breaking them down into things that are easier to do. That takes just some imagination, creative thinking with the person that you're working with. And then we've got things like the Staying Well toolkit. So now you've done 6 weeks of behavioral activation. What activities mostly helped you with feeling better? What skills have you learned through behavioral activation? Just reflect on those skills. And 9 times out of 10, pretty much everyone will say, even if I don't feel like it, do it. It's really important. And then what helps you put in those activities? So actually, sometimes you can have, when you plan an activity and some barriers might come up. So it might be an act of simply doing the laundry. I say simply because there's a lot involved with doing the laundry. If we really break it down, doing the laundry involves making sure that you have at least a detergent, if not a fabric softener as well, if you're one of those people. I don't, I'm really bad for that. But you've got at least to have your detergent, your fabric softener. You've got to have at least an hour for the cycle to run. And then after your cycle has run, you've got to have some way of drying the clothes. Where are you going to dry them? How are they going to be hung up? You've got to make sure that they've got enough time to dry if you don't have a dryer and you don't have a space to take them outside and maybe it's the middle of winter. So how are you going to manage all of that? There's multiple steps within that. And actually doing the laundry, sometimes, even though it's a necessary activity, needs to be broken down. So maybe on the Monday, you might go, right, I'm just going to check if I've got some detergent. If I don't have enough detergent, I'm going to go to the shops and buy just detergent. On the Tuesday, I'm going to make sure that I have a place to dry my clothes, or I check the weather to see if I can put them outside. So real simple things that can really make the activity less strenuous for someone. So that's kind of the overview of behavioral activation. Essentially, act your way out of low mood before you can think your way out. So we're going to move on to the cognitive approaches. So basic principles of cognitive restructuring. We've got our same low mood cycle there. So the thought process might be, I'm struggling to even solve problems. That physically might make me feel tearful, or I might have difficulty concentrating. Then my emotions might be feeling really low and down. And then my behavior might be, I'm just staying in bed for longer and I'm eating more. So the whole process with cognitive restructuring is to understand the power of our thoughts. So I'm really struggling to even solve simple problems feels already quite damning because it's even simple problems. It's quite belittling in that statement. Then we're going to identify what unhelpful thinking patterns are present within that space. And then we're going to label them. And labeling is a way to externalize the thought almost from yourself so it feels less consuming and it feels like other. So I'm currently working with someone who can be very self-critical. So instead of kind of saying, oh, well, we're going to pay attention to all of those negative thoughts that you're having, I'm saying, okay, was that you that said that, or was that the self-critical part? And by externalizing it as the self-critical part, we've been able to name that part Terry the Tit. And that's their alliteration, not mine. They chose that. So Terry the Tit can sometimes come in, and every time he's feeling great, Terry the Tit can come in and take over and go, well, you shouldn't feel any of this because you're rubbish, you're useless, you're a failure, nobody loves you. But actually, that's Terry. So just externalizing, saying, Terry's trying to take over right now. What do you choose to believe? So labeling unhelpful thinking styles kind of works in a similar way to that, is that you're externalizing that thinking to a point where it has less impact and less power over our cycle of emotions, physical feelings, behavior, and thoughts. Then what we're going to do, and sometimes that's enough, but taking it further, we're going to start challenging those thoughts. So when I say challenging your thought, something that we always used to say in PWP land is take your thought to court. So we'll go into what that means in a bit, but we're going to take our thought to court. And then we're going to create something called a hot thought and revise that hot thought. And if needed, oftentimes going through stages 1 to 6, just for one really difficult thought, and then maybe going through 1 to 4 is enough for people, but sometimes people need a little bit more. And that's when we get behavioral experiments. And that's where you do things like planning, doing, and then review. So understanding the power of our thoughts. So I think quite a lot of people will have had this example thrown at them. If you haven't, here's something new. But the idea is you're walking down your local high street. You see a friend walking down on the other side of the road. You wave, you shout hello, but they carry on walking and don't respond. All of us will have a reaction to that, whether that's a good reaction, a bad reaction, I wonder what's going on for them reaction, or what's happening. But we will all have some level of reaction to that. They must not like me anymore. How dare they ignore me? Oh my gosh, so rude. I must have done something to upset them. They must be angry at me. It's important, therefore, to understand the impact that those thoughts will have on us. So if I think I must have done something to upset them, I'm going to feel guilty. Potentially, I might feel some shame. What have I done? If I think, how dare they ignore me, I'm going to feel really angry. If I think, oh, they must not like me, I might feel embarrassed then for trying to say hello. And that might make me feel really uncomfortable with myself. So all of those things have direct influence on our emotions and therefore our physical feelings and potentially our behaviors of what we might do next. So again, it's noticing that impact. These thoughts, and I'm sure we're all aware because we all will have had thoughts that are really hard to get away from and come unstuck from. They're so hard and so difficult to ignore. And this is why sometimes we need to do the acting our way out of low mood before we think our way out, simply because those thoughts can be so consuming. We need to prove to ourselves physically, behaviorally, that we can do something. And that gives us the energy and the motivation and the sense of achievement that gives us enough to challenge the thinking. They can impact or shape our belief system, the relationships we have, decisions and perceived choices that we have throughout our life. And that's why it's so important to also pay attention to those thoughts when appropriate. So again, this is a extract. All of these are extracts from the CEDA guides at Exeter University. So what you've got here is a table that says, what's the situation? And you've got your 4 W's, which is the when, the what, the where, and the who. Then you've got your emotion. So what is the emotion you felt? Well, in this situation, it was a Friday evening. I saw on Facebook some of my friends had gone out for drinks without me. I was in my lounge and I was on my own. The emotion that I experienced was sad. And next to that emotion, you rate how strong it was on a 0 to 100 scale. I was 90% sad. It really felt like it consumed me, that sense of sadness. The thought then that I had as a result of that is that none of my friends want to be around me anymore. Nobody likes me. And then I rate my belief, or how strong the thought was. And for me, that was a 90%. That was really strong. So I'm really feeling sad 90%. I'm really feeling that none of my friends want to be around me. And the unhelpful thinking style then would be the negative view of how other people might see me. So what we're doing here is we're identifying, using the 4 W's, where you experienced a change of your emotions for the worse. We're writing down the emotion, how strong the emotion is. We're writing the thought and how much you believe the thought as a percentage. And then we're identifying an unhelpful thinking style. So the idea here is just to start to notice how much those thoughts or emotions interchangeably have an impact on how we think, feel, behave, and what we notice in our body. So bringing mindful awareness to those things. So with labeling unhelpful thinking styles, there's blooming loads of loads of thinking styles, and all of us will have them. So I just want you to kind of, as we go through them, just check in with yourself. Do I do this? Because I guarantee I know I do most of these quite often, and it's just helpful to know, I've got my mental filter on. I've got my gloomy specs on today, so I'm seeing the world through a quite negative lens. Or today I've got my specs on where I'm really optimistic and everything's great. So thinking about how you're filtering information. Judgments, spelled that wrong. So making evaluations or judgments, and that can be about yourself, it can be other people, the world, and that's instead of just describing factually what you see. And we're all very guilty of doing this. We're human. It's in our human nature to make judgments and to assess a situation and form an opinion. But it's really important with cognitive restructuring, at least in CBT, is to describe factually what's there. Prediction. So that's believing what we'll know what will happen in the future. Well, if I don't do this, then this thing's going to happen. It's all going to go to shit, and then everything's going to be rubbish. Then we've got things like mind reading. So assuming we all know what others are thinking, usually about ourselves. So right now I know that I'm mind reading everybody on this call thinking they all must think that this is the biggest load of shit and I'm doing terrible. So I'm mind reading. Then we've got mountains and molehills. So that can be things like exaggerating both the risk and all the negatives, but also in so doing, minimizing the things that could be positive. So I think we all do that to some degree. It's so much easier to believe negative things about ourselves than it is to believe positive things about ourselves. How many of us really struggle to receive like nice feedback? How many of us really worry about the future and think it's going to be way worse? And then we do the thing and it's actually nowhere near as bad as we thought it was going to be. We've got compare and despair. So seeing only the good and positive aspects of others, and then only comparing them to the negative things about ourselves. Then we've got things like emotional reasoning. This is where you might have your emotions and your thoughts or belief about yourself really kind of intertwine and blend. So this is where the externalizing can be really, really helpful if you've got someone that emotionally reasons this way. So I feel bad, therefore I am bad. That's a shaming kind of response. So really thinking about externalizing that can be really helpful and quite freeing for someone. Just naming, I'm noticing that I'm feeling really bad. Catastrophizing, so imagining or believing the worst possible thing can happen. So I'm catastrophizing and believing that this is all recorded. I'm going to say something absolutely horrendous that's going to be so offensive for someone, and I'm never going to live it down, and it's going to have an impact on my next job, and people aren't going to want to work with me, and oh my gosh. And genuinely, I'm not exaggerating, that is a thought that I have had, and Cheryl can attest to that. Then we've got things like critical self. How often, as humans, do we put ourselves down? We criticize and blame ourselves, and that can be for situations or events that have been completely outside of our control. And I think what's really important and something to highlight there is people that have had real trauma and kind of abuse histories. And when I say real trauma, it's not that that's real or not real trauma. I mean really impactful trauma. We can be very, very critical on ourselves, particularly with domestic violence, domestic abuse, and childhood trauma as well. It's quite a common thing that we might experience. Then we've got the black and white thinking. So it's either something or someone can be either good or bad, right or wrong. There is no shade of grey. So just helping someone see the shade of grey can be really life-changing for someone. We've got the shoulds and the musts. And I am so guilty of doing this. I should be able to do that thing. I must do that thing because otherwise I'm rubbish. It's the if and then the but. And it puts pressure on ourselves, and it creates sometimes some really unrealistic expectations that we're never going to meet. And as a result of that, it feeds that vicious cycle of low mood. Then we've got things like memories. So current situations or events can trigger upsetting memories, and that then believes or makes us believe that the danger is here and now rather than a memory in the past. So just noting that that distress is no longer happening, you're safe in that moment, but just noting that that kind of mirroring or memory situation is happening. So that's a list of unhelpful thinking styles. So once you've labeled it, and you've gone through and gone, do you know what, right there, I was comparing myself to somebody else thinking I was absolutely rubbish, I can then start to challenge my thought. So as per the previous example, the thought that he had as a result of feeling sad 90% of seeing his friends on Facebook were going to a party without him was, none of my friends want to be around me anymore, no one likes me. The strength and belief in that thought was 90%. So that's what we put at the very top, and we go, right, this is the hot thought, kind of like the hot potato. Nobody wants to hold it, kind of pass it around. It's really uncomfortable, it burns. What we're going to do now is we're going to take the thought to court. So typically this hot thought, if you've got a whole week of thoughts and situations and events, and someone brings you the entire list of those thoughts, usually what you choose to identify as the hot thought is the one that causes the most distress and has the strongest link to the emotion that you identified. So there might be other experiences throughout the week where I felt really dejected, I felt really, really sad, but I've not felt it to 90% level as this one. So it's the thought that causes the most distress. That's the one that's called the hot thought. So where possible, it's really helpful to work on a thought that has at least a 60% belief and an emotion that's 60% strong. The reason for that is we don't want to work on something that's 30 or 40% because we might not fully believe it already anyway. We're kind of already a bit ambiguous about whether or not that thought is true or not. We've already got some flexibility and critique around whether or not that thought is as much as we believe it. So we really want to try and find something that's distressing, because the more distressing that we can work on, the more we can kind of get through that emotion, and everything else will start to become easier. The thoughts that you bring then will become easier to challenge because it is the most distressing thing that you're challenging first. We're going to write the hot thought at the top of the worksheet that we have, or a sheet of paper, whatever works for you. And then we try and balance the evidence that you collected for and against that hot thought. So what we've got as examples here, and this is where the take your thought to court kind of sits in, is although many of our unhelpful thoughts are just thoughts and not facts, sometimes we may find them to be really, really unhelpful and understandably really, really distressing. So sometimes realizing that there are many more, or there may be more features in our unhelpful thoughts that might maybe give us, that have some truth into them, that can be helpful to kind of start our first step into sorting out a problem or a difficulty. So what that might mean is evidence for the hot thought. So John told me he didn't want to be around me anymore as I'm no fun. Some of my friends went out without me for drinks. Since I got divorced, I heard Aki say I was a loser and no one wanted to be around me. So what you'll notice with this is an example that I always use. I've realized how scattergun I am today, so I apologize. My brain's running at 3,000 miles an hour about different things. But an example that I always bring to therapy is I always try and use humor wherever I can. So the example that I always use, and I'm sure you all know Cheryl, even mildly from some of your bite-sized trainings, I'll go, oh, someone slashed my tires. Okay, that's the situation. Someone has slashed my tires. And I have the hot thought that, well, look at Cheryl, it was definitely her. I believe that thought 90%. I'm really angry with her, and it's 80% strength, that anger. And the evidence for my hot thought or against my hot thought always needs to be built in around facts. When you go to court, you can only use factual evidence. You can't use opinion. So this is why we say take your thought to court, not based on what you think and feel. So someone might say, well, why do you think it was Cheryl? And I go, well, look at her. She's dodgy looking. She looks like she'd steal a car. That's never going to stand up in court. But me going, well, Cheryl was around my car around the time that I noticed my tyres got slashed. That's a factual evidence. So going, that's not going to stand up in court. So really trying to pull back, is that opinion or is that fact? And that's the key for around revising the hot thought or challenging the hot thought. So there might be some really helpful questions to ask to help elicit some of those challenges. Because some people are really, really wedded to that hot thought of, well, nobody wants to be around me. Nobody wants to be my friend anymore. So some questions you can ask in conversation are, what would I say to a friend who has had this thought in a similar situation? What evidence would my friends or family give to help me with this thought? What if I wasn't feeling this way? Would I believe this? So if I wasn't feeling really sad at 90%, would I believe this thought at the strength of 90%? Would that influence? If so, why? Because we know that thoughts, emotions, physical feelings, and behaviors are all interlinked in that CBT here and now cycle. We all know that they have a knock-on effect to each other. So questioning by what degree, if we separate that, can actually help us gain some space and some distance. And if I rate my hot thought as 85%, or in this case, in the example, 90%, then there's another 15 or 10% of that thought that I don't believe it to be true. What is that? What makes that up? Why don't I believe that to be true? And then sometimes you can go, and this is kind of like a more of a mentalizing stance, I guess, is, am I looking at the entire picture, or is there another way of looking at the situation? So sometimes that might involve stepping into a friend and looking at their perspective, or stepping away into a different space. So it could be a work colleague or someone that has eyes on the situation that isn't you, and trying to see how they might see the situation. This one is really interesting and always gets a response from a lot of the clients that I work with is, will this matter in 6 months' time? And most people will say no. And I'll go, okay, why not? Why won't it matter in 6 months? So then once you've got an idea of trying to challenge that hot thought, what we can do is revise it. So now we've got the evidence for, the evidence against, we've taken it to court, we've elicited challenges from that hot thought. Now our job is to consider how we might create a more balanced thought. So the idea behind a more balanced thought is we're not going to create something that's entirely opposite. So if you remember with this example, it's my friends don't want to be around me, they don't care about me anymore. The opposite of that is, well, my friends love me and they want to spend all of their time with me. That's equally also not true. So what we need to do is try and find something in there that's more balanced. And extreme thinking in either a negative or a positive way is just completely unhelpful. So what we can see on this example is I do have friends that care about me. Maybe I sometimes need to make more effort to see them, which is also really, really common in low mood, is that we're not making as much effort as we can. Okay. My belief in that thought is I believe it 50-50. I'm not sure. Okay, great. It's not 0. It's still 50. So what brings it from 0 to 50? What's that space? What's that difference? Let's focus on that. You're going to note down the original emotion that you felt, which in this case was sad. And actually now you've looked at the revised thought and you now believe 50% that you have friends that care about you and you just need to go and see them a couple of times. The strength in that emotion now has dropped from 90% to 60%. Okay, there's been some movement there. We're not looking for something that's completely perfect. We're just looking to kind of notice that that thinking style can be a little bit tricky. And now that that sadness has reduced, actually we might start to see other things in the cycle, like physical symptoms, other thoughts, behaviors, other emotions start to creep in, so it's not as consuming. We write down how much we believe in it as a percentage, and we write down the original emotion. So exactly what I've just said there. Now, this has happened to me before. I don't believe in my revised balanced thought. Okay, that's fine. So what I would always do is just reinforce the idea of normalizing that, you know, if these thinking styles are really ingrained, that can take a lot of time and a hell of a lot of effort, real conscious thinking effort, even a few weeks before you start to notice that hard work paying off. And it feels like a lot of effort. And this is, again, why I would always say try the behavioral activation stuff first, because of the sheer amount of effort that it takes. So over time, these steps might become a lot easier. However, suddenly you might have a thought that's really difficult to challenge, and that's also okay. So it's just finding ways that we can work with it and not against it. So totally normal. And actually, with all of those thinking styles, so things like catastrophizing, mountains out of molehills, mental filter, judgments, compare and despair, all of those are thinking styles have become habitual. And like any habit, it just takes a long time to break, just normalizing that. Also, something with CBT that I personally find as both someone that's used it and someone that's been a client with it is that logically, we might know that the revised thought is accurate, but we might feel like it isn't. And that's really common for people that go through CBT. And that's something that we call the kind of heart-head lag. And that's really, really common. So in that case, if the continued practice remains ineffective, then that's when we can start to try the behavioral experiments. So for someone that has the heart-head lag, sometimes the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. So we might actually try a behavioral experiment, test out the revised thought, and actually they then might fully emotionally feel that that's true. So behavioral experiments, again, the plan, please check the plan out on Cedar Exeter University online, because the plan is there. But essentially what you would do is at the very start, you'd write down the thought that you want to test. So that would be the revised, more balanced thought. You'd rate your belief in it. And then you'd plan how you would test it. So this is where you use your 4 W's. So you what, you where, you when, you who. You'd also think about predicting an alternative. So this might either be a really, really bad thing, or it could be something more balanced. But try to ensure it's at least slightly different from your worst prediction. Okay?
Okay.
Oh. Hello?
Oh, sorry. I was
okay.
agreeing with you. I didn't realise that it was on loud.
Oh, sorry, that's okay. You carry on. I was like, oh, what have I done? My mind reading again thought, oh shit, I've done something wrong.
No, I was like, okay, sorry.
That's okay. So if I use the example on the sheet that's here, so we've got running with the same example, it's I do have friends that care about me. I just need to make more effort to see them. They believe that 50%. So when you design the experiment with the what, the where, the when, the who, you'll go, right, what am I going to do? I'm going to phone my friend and I'm going to ask them to go out for a drink after work next week. I'm going to do it at my house and I would like to meet them on Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. And I'm going to do this phone call on my own. Sometimes it's okay to have someone with you if it's a really difficult thing, that's okay. Then what you do is predict the worst. So the worst thing that I think can happen is that he'll hang up the phone on me. I believe that that is 70% accurate. That's almost certainly going to happen. Okay? That's your worst prediction. Now we think, what's an alternative? Well, the alternative is that he'll answer the phone, but he won't be able to make it a drink and he'll make an excuse. Okay, so how much do you believe that will happen? Well, I think that's 90% true. That's if he doesn't hang up the telephone, he's 90% going to say, no, I don't want to do it. He's going to make up an excuse. So what we do then is we think about what possible barriers might come up. So he might have an unhelpful thinking style about what might happen. He might feel even worse if he doesn't answer or turns him down. Actually, they're really tired in the evenings and they might not have energy to do it in the first place. And then you think, okay, how am I going to overcome those barriers? So it might be, although I'm really worried about what might happen, I do need to give it a go. That's okay. We need friends in life. We're herd animals naturally anyway. We're supposed to be part of a crowd. That's okay. We need to give it a go. And actually, I might be tired, but it's really important to me and I really want to give it a go and I really want to be there for my friend. Great. So what we're doing there is we're looking at the thought, we're designing an experiment, we're predicting the worst thing that could happen, we're predicting an alternative thing that could happen that's also scary, and then we're identifying the possible barriers and how we might overcome them. That's essentially what we're doing and how we plan a behavioural experiment. Then we do it. And that's terrifying for a lot of people. So I think what's really important here is that barriers will come up all over the place and actually things that we might not have predicted might come up. So they can be really internal things or they can just be external things. So the plan is they might want to go out for a drink on Tuesday, but childcare might fall through and that's okay. So there's some learning and there's review that can happen in this space. So the idea is that we write the hot thought or the thought down that we wanted to test, the original prediction, and then actually what did actually happen. And here in this example, it's Steve answered the phone with an exclamation mark. We had a really long chat. Steve said he'd been pretty worried about me. We ended up arranging going for a beer after work the following week. What did you learn? So that person's learning is that I do still have friends. Although things have happened in my marriage, that's not necessarily the case. Not necessarily the case that everyone blames me for them. Maybe I've been too hard on myself. And then what we'd do is we'd revise that thought again. And that thought now for this person is, I have friends who still care about me and don't necessarily blame me for everything that's happened. I fully believe this thought. So we write down that new thought, we rate how strongly we believe it, and then we think about things that we might do differently. So based on what we've learned, this person might then do more of making the effort, might call Steve more, make sure they get in touch with other friends that you haven't seen for a while, and they can't wait for people to get in contact with them. And then we think about, well, what do we do next? So are there any other behavioural experiments that we want to try? Is there anything else that you want to put into practice? And that's what we do from there. And we can build on that. So everyone that I've used behavioural experiments with, I would say on average, for kind of real scores of low mood to kind of come down, I've probably used it a couple of times. What I often find is that going through the whole thing through one round of behavioural experiments and then just starting to identify those thinking habits is just enough. People will then go, oh, I'm noticing that I'm mind reading again. Oh, I'm noticing that I'm being really self-critical. Oh, I'm noticing that I'm judging. Okay, that's enough to kind of just externalize the thought and not hold on to it so strongly. But some people need the proof in the pudding. And this is the way that we would do that. So what I've just kind of alluded to there is something called thought catching. So this is where you can put thought challenging into practice in the moment that you notice yourself having that unhelpful thought. So this means you can stop or weaken the thought before it feeds into that cycle that impacts your emotions, your behaviors, your physical sensations, and further thoughts. And it's important to remember that those different thoughts affect us very differently at different times. So this is where the 4 W's of what, where, when, and who are really important to remember as well. So in time and with practice, so as I've done already on the call today, I've noticed, oh, I'm mind reading. They almost think I'm terrible. And I've just volunteered that when someone came through speaking on the microphone. So I can identify that and then just take a deep breath and go, abs, your mind reading, let it go. It's only going to get worse if I engage with that thought. And we can begin to recognize that thoughts aren't things that necessarily have so much power over us. So in a very kind of compassionate mindfulness approach, we just label them as mental events. These mental events happen and they're not facts. They just happen in the mind based on the situation, based on the context, based on the time that just happened, but that doesn't mean that they're true. Another thing that's really important to remember is when we're already feeling really tired, really low, we might not, or we might listen to and engage in those thoughts even more because we have less energy to fight them. So just having like a little mindful check-in with what resources you have in terms of your internal resources of energy, sleep, food, external resources of friends, sounding things off with people. And that's something that can be really helpful to sit with when you're having a chat with someone. So self-practice, self-reflection. I'm a massive fan. If you're going to use it, do it. And I think it's so helpful because it really gives us a much deeper understanding. What I've done here is whiz through in about just over an hour of all the things that it took me essentially months to learn in an Exeter course. So this is very, very basic overview. So I would always encourage you to do it yourself. So as I keep saying, the Exeter CEDAR guides for low intensity CBT work are freely available on the website. And find one for behavioral activation. I think it's called Think Good, Feel Good. No, that's thought challenging. There's one, and I will find it for you. But maybe just choosing behavioral activation. So it's essentially a process of structured self-reflection, really. So you're going to observe an experience. So using thoughts, feelings, behaviors, physical sensations. Just observe what happened in a moment that caused you a certain feeling. It could be joy, it could be anxiety, it could be stress. What did you feel? What did you notice? Clarify that experience. Was that experience helpful? My behavior as a result of feeling that way, was that useful or not useful? And how does that impact on the way that you work with people that you're working with? And then actually it helps us really reflect, and I know I do this a lot, which is the implications of the experience for how I see myself as someone in the workforce of healthcare. So I know I can come in and go, when I was really depressed, I couldn't shower. That's a totally normalizing experience. And I know that because I've done the self-practice, self-reflection, I've been in that therapy space. And it's okay to bring that part of yourselves. But also it has implications for understanding, insert therapy theory anywhere. It doesn't have to be CBT. You can use it for any modality. But it really, when we were forced, I will say we were forced to do self-practice, self-reflection, actually it was really, really helpful because I was not a fan of certain other kind of interventions. And then I did them and I was like, oh, okay, actually it's not that bad. It's actually all right. That was quite helpful. So I would strongly recommend that you try and do that because it helps with kind of your knowledge. It helps with when and how we might implement that knowledge into practice. It helps us with all of those reflective skills. And then what's really important from Black Dog is to try and stay strong. Your black dog will go away soon. And I always feel really bad because he's throwing the stick off the cliff and I feel really bad for the dog. But at the same time, by depression, by low mood. And that is everything. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to open up, because everybody's been, I'm sure, setting on some questions, although I hope not too many because I'm terrified now. But please fire away if you've got any.